What is so appealing to us about human rights? That would be an interesting discussion for us to have. When I try to reflect on that question myself, I'm struck by both words. And I think that we rush to the word rights. And there's something about rights that's very reassuring. This idea that there are norms, there are values, there are moral edicts that are so important and so important to enforce, so we want to make sure we put them in decisive, clear language, that we codify them. And so we call it human rights, not the great human moral consensus or something else, because we want these to be enshrined in clear and decisive language that can then be enforced, hopefully, in some way. But then there's also the word human in there, which I think we should not gloss over the importance of that, because it's an assertion of a common humanity, and I think we can understand the importance of this assertion in the aftermath of World War II. This idea that while we may divide up humanity into races, and we may divide up humanity into peoples, and we may divide up humanity into countries, in some fundamental way we are a human family, and that there are certain values and morals that should be encapsulated in that assertion. Some of the major human rights documents, you've probably studied or at least heard of most of these. You can see here, and I won't go through them. I think that the names of many of them are self-evident. Beyond these central human rights documents and covenants, there are other aspects of human rights which are also very important. I believe some of you read the article by David Morrison, Human Rights in a New Era, Wars for Peace. And there he's talking, I think in an interesting way, about emerging norms of humanitarian intervention, and he talks about the right to protect. These are new practices that are emerging in the international sphere that don't come directly from a codified body of human rights law. They are emerging norms, and that's part of the human rights picture as well. And we also want to remember that a lot of the work of human rights isn't just done at the high level of the Security Council of the United Nations. It's done through the hard work of non-governmental organizations and activists and people who are trying to take international human rights law from the stratosphere down to the local level, to integrate it into national law, to get it to apply at a local level where it's really going to make a difference. Okay, I want to, I promised you I would say something about anthropology and how anthropology sees these issues, so let me talk for a moment about my discipline. Anthropology, especially cultural anthropology, the subfield of cultural anthropology, is very committed to understanding culture and validating culture and appreciating cultures on their own terms. So there's sort of an orientation or a bias in anthropology which says that the values, the beliefs, the norms that exist at a local cultural level are very important. And two of the principles that guide anthropological thought and research are ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. And when we talk about ethnocentrism, there's this edict here that says we really shouldn't judge, and we certainly shouldn't put cultures, we shouldn't think of cultures as being in some sort of a hierarchy of civilization or good versus bad or civilized and savage, that we really want to look at different cultures and cultural diversity from the perspective of cultural relativism, which means to really understand and appreciate each culture on its own terms. Now, as I'm describing this, you can begin to imagine that there might be some conflict with human rights, because what is the Human Rights Project asserting? It's asserting there's some transcultural, universal set of rights, and that those rights are designed to enforce certain norms. And then what happens at the local cultural level, and how do anthropologists think this through if they're starting with the premise that all cultures are, at least in some degree, sacrosanct and important on their own terms. Moreover, anthropologists frequently study societies that were formerly colonized by the European powers. I did my research in Senegal, which is a former French colony, as you know. And so because of that historical understanding, we're very sensitive to this notion of imposition. When I study the history of Senegalese law, it's a complicated history, but one really crucial piece is that the French came in and overturned their conventional traditional legal systems and said, no, do it this way, do it this other way, with a tremendous degree of sort of arrogance and imposition that undermined a lot of the local culture. So we're sensitive to this and we're concerned about this. And if you, I put an intentionally provocative quote. This is from anthropologist Wade Davis, and he kind of gives us this in-your-face phrase, a couple of sentences here to try to encapsulate the anthropological point of view of culture. The world in which you were born, he says you, right? He's not saying we, he's saying you. It's almost like an accusation. The world in which you were born is just one model of reality. You may have thought it was the best, but it's just one. Other cultures are not failed attempts at being you. This is great to use with undergraduates, right? Because you can imagine it gets them thinking in a way that they haven't thought. They are unique manifestations of the human spirit. To me, anyway, I'm an anthropologist. This is a beautiful notion. He's a little hostile, maybe in the way he says it, but they are unique manifestations of the human spirit. I think that's a beautiful phrase. I also think some of the assertions of the Human Rights Project are beautiful phrases too. What are we to make of this potential conflict? Mikhail Matua he's not an anthropologist, he is a East African legal scholar who I believe his most recent position, he's one of these folks who has had many high-level positions. I think his most recent is the Dean of the University of Buffalo Law School, and he's written extensively on issues of human rights and culture, and as an East African, he's very sensitive to the ways in which the Human Rights Project has certain Western biases built into it, and he's sensitive to the ways in which those come across as an imposition. And he elaborates on this notion of imposition by developing this metaphor, what he calls savages, victims, and saviors, the metaphor of human rights. And I'm going to throw a few longish quotes at you. I beg your indulgence with that. There are some things other people have said better than I think I can say them, so I'm asking you to take a look at it here. The SVS, or savages, victims, and saviors metaphor and narrative rejects the cross-contamination of cultures and instead promotes a Eurocentric ideal. The metaphor is premised on the transformation by Western cultures of non-Western cultures into a Eurocentric prototype. Savage cultures and people are seen as lying outside the human rights orbit. So he's saying, in his extensive reading and study of the human rights, covenants and human rights discourse, that there is a really profound Eurocentric bias, and that the Human Rights Project sort of can't help itself but to enact that bias as it seeks to enforce human rights law, change national laws, and get different societies around the globe to comply with human rights norms.